And with that, we're now moving to the last talk of our session on LLMs. So we're going to have Emma Kallina. She's going to be presenting on Stakeholder Involvement for Responsible AI Development, a Process Framework.
Hi, so I'm going to talk about this paper from Jat and myself. Jat is sitting there, maybe wave, yes, that's him. As the title says, is what we try to do. Actually has nothing to do with LLMs, but I'm harnessing this session. So what we try to do is to think, if you're someone working in AI industry and you want to involve stakeholders to advance like responsible AI goals, what do you have to do? And what are the challenges at each of these stages? Please. Oh, okay, sorry. I'm sorry, I have my slides here and okay, sorry. So what I talk about when I talk about stakeholder is, I mean an individual that is having a right, share, claim, or interest in a system or in its possession of characteristics that meet their needs and expectations. That's a definition from ISO, but we can also just call them affected communities, really. And if you see SHI, that means just stakeholder involvement in these slides. So what motivated this work is if you're someone in AI industry, and I'd worked as UX researcher before, and I just feel there's a lot of responsible AI guidance that's put out there, and that tells you you need to do more participatory development or stakeholder engagement, but no one really says what that means. And that just means that you get handed this responsibility that is potentially included in future soft or hard law regulations, but at the same time, you don't really know what you need to do. But if you want to do the right thing, you don't actually, you run into several problems. You don't have the time to really look at what's out there in academic literature. There's a lot out there, it's confusing. At the same time, a lot of what you will learn is probably conflicting with a lot of internal structures and processes that are going on. So what we try to do is in this paper, is to answer, what would you actually have to do? What are the steps? And then for us researchers to understand, what are the challenges there? So how can we better help to overcome these different problems? Oh God, I completely forgot to do the slides. I'm sorry. Okay, let's just close this. I think it's just confusing me. There we go. This is just little icons that said what I just said. So to do this, we developed this process framework that kind of defines the different steps when doing stakeholder involvement for responsible AI development. I'm going to say 3 things about related literature. The first thing is that there's a lot of evidence that following any sort of responsible AI guidance in practice is difficult. Whether this is responsible AI principles or fairness metrics, whenever we academics have a good idea of what people should do in practice, it's actually not that easy. So we just assume that this might be similar for stakeholder involvement, and there's also first evidence pointing in this direction. The second thing I'm going to say is that there's a lot of ambiguity around stakeholder involvement, and there's a work from Greenwood from the business ethics literature, and there she says that stakeholder involvement is actually ethically neutral. And what she means by this is she puts out this quadrant where she says only if you involve stakeholders a lot, so along the process several times, but also with a lot of decision agency or authority, which means you're not just listening to them, but you follow through with what they tell you, whether you like that or not. Only then it can be considered an ethical practice. And when developing this framework, we try to push or promote stakeholder involvement that kind of goes into this top right quadrant. The last thing I'm going to say is around stakeholder involvement in healthcare, because there are a lot of similarities to stakeholder involvement for responsible AI development. I'm quickly going to highlight 3 of them. So the first one is that stakeholders are really diverse and difficult to pinpoint. So there's different care facilities, clinicians, patients, their carers, maybe health secretaries, and so different people. Then they have very often contradictory needs, like maybe clinicians want to spend more time with patients, hospitals want to save money, patients want good health, and at the same time, negative outcomes are most likely to affect already disadvantaged communities because they're often of worse health, so they're more reliant on the healthcare system. Considering these similarities, it's not that surprising that there is quite similar research in healthcare on stakeholder involvement than what we kind of see emerging for responsible AI. And I'm going to highlight one specific work here that I found from Way and Miller. And there they synthesized 24 studies that study stakeholder involvement or use stakeholder involvement in the healthcare context. And what they've done there is to abstract 30 elements of effective stakeholder involvement from the specific use cases and contexts. And interestingly, they abstracted them so much that they're nearly all perfectly relevant for responsible AI development. Which brings me then to my method, because that was the, has a bit of a lag, sorry. Yeah, okay, that was too much clicking. Anyway, so I used these 30 elements to develop a preliminary framework where I brought these 30 elements, or the ones that were relevant, in an order, grouped them by stages, which the idea was kind of to say, okay, which of these do you need to fulfill in a sufficient quality before you can enter the next one in a sufficient quality? And then I did semi-structured interviews with 10 AI practitioners that were really experienced in stakeholder involvement, and just asked them, what are challenges you experience? What are you doing when you do stakeholder involvement? And then I used these insights to adapt the framework, arriving at the final one. Yeah, so that brings me to the framework. I'll quickly talk you through. So first thing, you need to have the right organizational attitude so that people in your organization see the value of, well, we should do stakeholder involvement. Then you need to have the resources, then the right scope of stakeholder involvement, which is probably the most important one to bring it in this top right gradient we've seen earlier. So this means you start stakeholder involvement early with a lot of decision authority, so the stakeholders actually can influence what's happening. And also a bigger scope of stakeholders, right? Not just revenue critical, typical users, but a wider scope of people. Then you need the know-how to actually do this type of stakeholder involvement. Recruit a representative and inclusive sample. Establish a shared knowledge base, which means it's kind of setting the scene to then be able to talk meaningful about the system. So at first, people need to understand what's going on in each other's area. Then communicate effectively with the stakeholder at the point of talking about the system or the context of the system. And then actually it's not over, right? Then you need to store the insights. You need to communicate them to your colleagues. Prioritize which one of you're going to use to then decide what's happening with your system. And then it's best practice to communicate that back to the stakeholder so they know what their involvement did. When we now look at the challenges, I'm quickly going to talk through them. Then there are a lot. And for example, at the first stage, we found that a lot of people reported that their colleagues or even themselves have specific agendas, and they don't really want to collect insights that might mean they're not going to get what they want. And at the same time, they're lacking a structured stakeholder involvement process, or people don't stick to it. Available resources, easy, no time, no money. Then the scope, that was a bit sad, which I guess we can all guess. I don't think I'm telling anything new here, but the reported stakeholder involvement currently was mainly driven by commercial interests and not getting sued, obviously. So that kind of leads to a very narrow scope of stakeholder involvement that is not in this top right quadrant we've seen earlier. And also, so a lot of the stakeholder involvement was reported to be just evaluating things that's already there, like a prototype, instead of kind of co-designing objectives, like what is the useful use of AI to make your life or your workplace easier or better. Know-how is interesting because a lot of the people I asked, so I've asked everyone if they follow best practices, and a lot of people said they don't know because they don't know what best practices are, and that they really want more concrete guidance on that. Yeah, then recruitment, I guess as researchers we all know that that's difficult. Difficult to get a representative sample, and especially specific stakeholders, often vulnerable groups, are harder to access. Shared knowledge base. I learned something new here because, I don't know, I feel often in literature it's a little bit like, oh yeah, we need to make the stakeholders understand what AI is and how it works so they can give us like meaningful insights. But actually, a lot of it is also the other way around. Like you need to understand their context to a certain extent before you can actually get something out when talking about the system. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Then at the point of actually talking with the stakeholder about the system, interestingly, not that many challenges were reported. The main one was that people say, oh, I like this or I don't like this without saying why. But I mean, then you can just prompt them. So it was generally reported as a fairly easy step. Perceived easy step, we don't know. Then the storage. Yeah, so the storage, it's difficult. And a lot of people reported that they're trying to have something like a shared repository where also people in customer service or sales that speak to potential customers and clients, unfortunately not affected non-users, but anyway, to store that in one shared place so that everyone can look at it, but they had massive problems with this. Like only one person I interviewed said it's kind of working, but they also invested a lot of resources in it, like they had a whole role just looking at that. Then the internal communication, so it was apparently quite difficult to motivate colleagues to engage with this, especially technical colleagues, and so they were kind of scared that a lot of insights were lost or not reacted to. This step was actually more complex than I thought initially. So there's not only that you learn different things from different stakeholders, but it's also that what you learn from the stakeholders might conflict with commercial agendas of the company, which makes it really hard to convince deciders to kind of react to the needs that you found from stakeholders. And then at the last step, well, like no one did that. Just no one actually fed back to the stakeholder what the impact was. One person reported that they used to do this, but it was too much effort, so they stopped. So what's the contribution of this framework? So I hope that it can help practitioners to reflect on their current practices, their best practices, and what is blocking them in getting there, just to like better communicate what's happening and have more targeted interventions. And then I think for us researchers, it can really help to reflect about the same things, but also to scope future research. So to look at, okay, which of these stages or challenges have been a little bit out of focus in research and we can maybe put a bit more effort in. And then also to reflect on the type of challenges. And I'm going to talk about what I mean by this now. Because looking at these different challenges, I felt like it's quite obvious that they can be clustered in 3 categories. The first one is know-how challenge. So we don't know in academia how to do this. Best practices here are a little bit unclear. Second one is, we know in academia, but it's very siloed and we haven't managed to put this into practice. The third one is, we all kind of know what we need to do, but the commercial reality makes that very unattractive, so people don't do it. And this is obviously tied to different types of interventions. First one, quite obviously, is more research. Second one is more tools or guidance that can be useful for people in practice. Anyway, and then the last one is optimizing the incentive structure, like changing it so that doing the right thing is a bit more attractive. Ah, it works now. Or it worked once. Come on. Anyway, I think with the incentive gaps, I don't think I'm telling anyone here something new, but in the HCI literature, I feel like, in my entire master's in HCI, I feel that was very ignored. It was like, oh, we just need to build more user-centered systems and then everything is fine. But actually, it's often really not that useful to build more user-centered systems for the commercial reality of companies. So we need to kind of stop ignoring that and saying, okay, that's a problem, and that's maybe a little bit out of scope of what we can do in academia. The first 2, absolutely. Third one, I don't know. So what to do with this now? Yeah, so I hope to motivate future research. This can be both on expanding the framework or to adapt it to different research areas where it might be more stages, different stages, I don't know. And then also to answer specific questions, such as, if it's actually something I'm doing right now, but I look at available tools and guidance and I kind of map them to these different stages and challenges to see, okay, what have we addressed and what haven't we addressed? Also to say, okay, which challenges are actually new for AI, or which challenges have always been there in software development or even product development? Because this can help to understand, okay, which guidance or help do we need to update or need new ones? Or where can we actually look at stuff we already know, just it's in a different discipline right now. Well, I kind of know them by heart. Anyway, so the next one is to look at, okay, how often do these different challenges occur? So which ones should we target more often than others? Then different knowledge gaps, how can we better store the insights? How can we prioritize conflicting insights? And how can we inform stakeholders more efficiently of the impact they had? And yeah, the awareness gap is how can we bring the siloed knowledge of the academia better into practice, which is, yeah, how can we develop better tools and guidance? Because, yeah, the practitioners I asked literally said, I don't know best practice. So maybe this paper is helping a little bit. Yeah, and then the last one is, yeah, which policies or hard and soft law interventions can help to close the incentive gap. Yeah, that's it. That's the QR code to the full paper if you're interested. There's a lot more in the methods. I thought I'd talk more about the results because I think they're more interesting. But yeah, and sorry for the little bit slide problem at the beginning.
Any questions?
Hi, thank you for the very interesting paper. I think a lot of us do struggle with it, and it was good to see it all out there. So I'm super glad to see like the incentive gap with like a lot of attention to it. So in your interviews, have you found anyone describing incentives that work better for stakeholder involvement?
So I found a lot of people that really had like an internal dissonance because they really wanted to do the right thing and found it incredibly hard. And I interviewed really different people, like someone had a startup that was sort of helping with like public assemblies, like citizen assemblies to make them more fair in the widest sense. I don't want to identify this person, so I'm going to stay quite abstract. So he was thinking really a lot about that. And he really wanted to do the right thing, and he wanted to ask loads of people, but he was like, I have limited funding, investors really don't care. So I want to do this down the line, but right now I just like don't have the money to do it. Yeah, I presented some of these findings also at a big tech company, and there people were like, God, this is actually too close to home. Like, it was interesting because I felt a bit patronizing coming there as an academic, saying like, hi, this is challenges people in practice face, when they were actually doing that. But they actually really enjoyed the talk and said that they struggle with a lot of them, especially more towards the end, because they were allowed to go through the first stages quite nicely, but then at the prioritizing insights point, it got a bit more tricky. Yeah, no, I don't know.
Hi, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. So this is something that I think everyone in the room would probably agree is inherently a good thing, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate further on what are explicit examples of benefits that can be gained from informing stakeholders of the impacts that their feedback is having on pipelines.
Yeah, there is I actually forgot the name of the paper. There's a full paper talking about this, but I also think that there is the right thing to do. It will incentivize them to help in the future, right? It's like the self-efficacy question. If you know you had impact, you're more likely to contribute in the future. Or if you didn't have impact, then it's good to know why. Like I did a different study in air traffic control where a lot of the people, they were very, very closely involved in the system development just because cost of error is very high, that sometimes their requests were overwritten, and that really led to quite a bad culture of like groupthink, sort of like these developers don't listen to us. But there were actually like really good reasons, because I talked to both, and there were really good reasons some of this wasn't reacted to. And I think if they would have known this, because air traffic controllers are obsessed with safety, and if they would have known that this was not done because of safety concerns, I think there would have been a very different dynamic and buy-in. So just transparency, really.
Got it. Thank you.
I think we might have time for one more question, if there's any.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk. I found it actually curious that the vocabulary was not a big issue for most of them, and I was thinking maybe it's because of the involvement is only in early stages, and like if the involvement was like especially for AI, for example, if we're thinking about that, there's a lot of technicalities, a lot of issues between different stakeholders. If we're thinking like about legal issues that some models would have, and like the vocabulary is always an issue when we're talking this, and I was just like wondering if you have an idea why.
You mean the vocabulary when talking to stakeholders about their needs or the abilities of the system, or?
Yeah, like in later stages, for example, that would actually.
Sorry, what do you mean with later stages?
Later stages of the development, you know, like at the evaluation stage, or like how, like when we go deeper in detail, then maybe like that would.
I feel in a way that's always been like, I worked as UX researcher before in healthcare, and I feel that's always been that no AI was involved at all. It was just, and I feel in a way that's your job as UX researcher, to manage to abstract to talk about their needs in a way that you can later abstract, okay, what does this mean to for the system? You know, you should be able to translate this yourself, then obviously go back and validate. That's one answer. So I think that's kind of your job as UX researcher, to learn how to do that. And then I think there's also a lot of tools that help with this. Like there is loads of decks of cards or mini introductions into machine learning that are really cute and like quite easy to understand within half an hour. If it's ongoing stakeholder involvement, I would really recommend to probably do that in the beginning. But generally, I mean, you involve stakeholders because you want to not know more about AI, you want to know more about their lived experience, and they're experts in this. So I think in a way it shouldn't be a terminology issue.
I was curious, and maybe that's sacrilege to even suggest it. When the incentives are misaligned, is it clear that one needs to change the incentive system rather than change the best practices?
I mean, so it's under review, so yeah, I have a different work where I'm kind of looking at the different benefits that sort of responsible AI guidance claims that stakeholder involvement can have. And they're quite big benefits for society. They're not necessarily big benefits for tech companies. But if we want to harness these benefits, like rebalancing the decision power over the future of where we want to go with AI, that can be, for example, in care or welfare, how we want to automate things like this, or better or earlier anticipate risks and harms that maybe don't yet or never, because it's so hard to sue this stuff, really affect your revenue, but we maybe as society don't want to happen, then I think we should change the incentive structure, not the best practices.
There is one last question here.
Thank you so much, Emma, for this work. When people talk about stakeholder involvement, I'm always curious, like, how we can make sure that this work is like this involvement is not exploitative, and what do you have any kind of thoughts on what kind of like compensation is valuable to these stakeholders, and how researchers, not just corporations, for example, can think about like adequate compensation, so we're not just kind of exploiting them and their time and expertise?
Yeah, so I think one thing is obviously payment, but then I also think the transparency about the impact on the one hand, but also the actual authority, like you actually will have impact. Not the like, I'm listening to you and then I'm taking from this what I like, but actually we are doing this together up to a point where you're more like the enabler of building what they need, like kind of being their tool, which is maybe on the very extreme side, but I mean, if you say, okay, I come here with my expertise about like what AI can do, and we want to build a system that makes your workplace nicer. I don't know, helps your community. Then I think most people would be motivated if it's like a respectful dialogue. Yeah, maybe a bit idealistic, but you know.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Emma.
Yeah.
Let's give-
Thanks for your questions, guys. They were really great.